Able to analyse these inflation numbers, I turn to a former UK Treasury official, now the global macro strategist at VTB Capital. Good morning, Neil MacKinnon. Thank you very much for coming in. This is good news for Mervyn King, good news for the economy?
I think it is good news for Mervyn King, because I think there was a danger that his credibility could have been affected if inflation had continued to rise. But I think it would have been pretty odd to see a persistent increase in the inflation rate. I mean, the UK economy is at the tail end of the major economies that are staging a recovery. The recovery doesn't look particularly strong. If anything, it looks a little bit on the anemic side, and it would look odd to sort of have a situation where you've got a weakish economy, where domestic demand isn't all that strong, yet inflation continues to rise. And the other thing to bear in mind is that look at all the money supply numbers, and I think it still is important to look at money supply. There's nothing that indicates that there's any inflation pressure. In fact, if anything, and we're seeing this more generally in the global economy, particularly in the G20 advanced economies, that the real risk, I think, is disinflation and even deflation.
Is deflation a possible risk in the UK? Surely not with these figures.
Not with these numbers. I mean, I think that certainly there is a cushion there. It's interesting to try and analyse and understand why we do have an inflation rate of 3% when you look at the American economy and even the Eurozone economy, where I think there is a real risk of deflation.
Well, we're the only people with inflation across the whole of Europe, right?
That's right. My guess is, I mean, I think Mervyn King, the Bank of England governor, is correct. A lot of the previous increases has been down to government measures. I think that underlying inflation will continue to subside in the months ahead.
Now, we were just talking earlier in the show about people coming up to this election concerned about the economy, concerned about, obviously, jobs, pay packets and prices. So a slightly lower inflation figure coming in today will be good for Alistair Darling. It makes for good headlines, right? It'll
certainly make for good headlines, and I think it'd be certainly welcome news in Downing Street and at the Treasury. And I think that certainly some recent economic numbers that are important for voters, I think, favour the government ahead of the upcoming elections. So better news on inflation, certainly welcome, although we've had a VAT increase, we've got fuel duty increases to come, and I think that the national insurance contributions that are being proposed for April 2011 aren't helpful in terms of job creation. But other things tomorrow, the budget, the budget is key, and certainly the speculation is that the Chancellor will be able to announce a slightly lower borrowing target.
Well, David Tweed has been across those numbers for us this morning. David.
Well, Neil, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the budget. I'm just wondering how important a credible budget or a credible explanation of how the Chancellor plans to exit this deficit is in terms of the future of monetary policy.
Well, I think that fiscal policy is important because the UK is in a pretty severe situation on any sort of comparison across the major economies. High budget deficits, 12–13% of GDP, and a debt-GDP ratio that has risen quite sharply as a result of the financial and economic crisis. So there is a longer-term problem about fiscal policy, and obviously the debate is how we address that and how we successfully reduce budget deficits without damaging the economy. I think as far as the Bank of England is concerned, there's probably less pressure on them to extend their quantitative easing programme, but I think at the moment they'll keep their options open and just see how the economy starts to move out of recession in the months ahead.
Now, of course, Neil, we're going to be looking at at an election coming up in probably around 6 weeks' time. Have the markets geared up for this, and what about the idea that there might be a hung parliament, which is looking increasingly likely on the current figures?
Well, I think the financial markets have certainly discounted a hung parliament, and the opinion polls at the moment suggest that that will be the case. There are a number of scenarios. Obviously, two other scenarios are that the Conservatives win a working majority, but it's interesting that Conservatives have not been really able to sustain a move above 40% in the polls. I think the more interesting scenario is where the Labour government actually wins with an outright majority. Remember that the UK electoral system does have this inherent bias that does favour the government. So
Indeed.
I think that might be the surprise.
And if that is the case, then we're looking at the deficit not being cut straight away. You think that would be the right move?
I think that's the right thing. I think that the Chancellor is correct. I think it would be too draconian to have the sort of fiscal adjustment over the course of one Parliament that's been suggested. I think the lesson is to proceed gradually and cautiously, have a credible medium-term package, and rather than have a bias towards tax increases, which I think would be very damaging, you've got to ensure that there is the capacity for investment to recover and for the economic recovery. You've got to get economic growth first before you start tackling the deficit.
OK, Neil MacKinnon, thank you very much indeed.